welcome to the Weekly Wrap with me, Luke Daniel, and of course, Connor Tomlinson. This week, we're going to be talking about the Netflix show Adolescence. Is the media manipulating the public opinion, particularly at the behest of the government? That's an interesting question we're going to have to ask. The Atlantic text leaks. What does it say about the US administration? The UK Spring Statement, and finally, Home Office, asylum contracts, police powers, and the Islamophobia bill. Connor, thanks for joining me. Let's talk about Adolescence. It's a Netflix show about a 13-year-old boy who was arrested on suspicion of murdering one of his female schoolmates. Before we talk about why it was made or anything like that, can you just tell me what the public perception has been of this Netflix show?
It's been, at time of recording, the most watched thing on Netflix for quite some time. It's only 4 episodes. From anything but the clips I've seen, the perception has been that it's well shot because it's filmed in one continuous shot per episode. It's well acted. It's well written as a self-contained drama. But eyebrows have been raised about comments by the show's creators as to the inspiration from this story. So the main character, and this is Jamie Miller, he's a 13-year-old boy, member of a fictional, let's say, aspirational working class family, married, 2-parent, in Yorkshire. Kind of kid who is more likely to get a non-crime hate incident for dropping a copy of the Quran at school than he is to go on a mass stabbing. And so people were a bit confused as to why there was a focus on this character having killed one of his schoolmates. This is the fictional murder of Katie Leonard for misogynistic reasons. Focus on Andrew Tate and the manosphere. Rather than the actual inspiration for the story, which, according to the main actor, named Stephen Graham, if I remember correctly, was the murder of a girl called Elaine Andam in Croydon in 2022. And she was stabbed to death at a bus stop by Hassan Sentamu. Now, not quite Jamie Miller. And this guy was from a tumultuous and broken home and had been abused at a boarding school in Uganda. So the assertion that the series is making to millions of people who have watched it and praised it is that because of misogynistic influences like Andrew Tate online, even the quietest, least suspecting white working class schoolboy can be turned into a misogynistic murderer within a few TikToks, rather than, unfortunately, largely ethnic minority boys who, as Rakib Hassan has written about for Spike this week, have a disproportionately positive view of the likes of Tate. The stats he provided from a survey were 41% of black boys, 31% of Asian boys, but only 15% of white boys had a positive view of Tate. The same black boys, 46% of children who reach 14 in Britain and don't live with their father, that's 57% of black Caribbean boys, 44% of black African boys, and only 22% of white boys. And black boys and men being responsible for, I think it's about 63% of all knife crime offences, about 61% and 53% of knife crime murders in London. People are wondering why, if that demographic is more likely to commit these violent crimes, more likely to have a favourable view of influences like Tate, and to come from broken homes, why a white working class white boy with 2 stable married parents is the subject depicted in this documentary. And the suspicion is that the focus on the arbitrariness of his indoctrination into murderous misogyny and the need for the state, the school system, social media regulators to contain the social contagion is the real reason it's been picked up and ran with. It's the real reason that there are calls to show it in Parliament, and Keir Starmer has invited the creators to Parliament. It's the real reason it was mentioned at Prime Minister's Questions last week. And now this sudden moral panic about a need for social media regulators like Ofcom, because of the online safety bill, to step in and censor manosphere content.
Right. So we'll get back to sort of whether the main character in this program really should be the archetype of this kind of violence towards women, particularly young and vulnerable girls in our society. But you just touched on it now. There is obviously a moral panic, which has been stimulated by the creation of this, work of fiction, work of art, whatever you want to call it. There are, there have been calls to have this shown in Parliament. There have been calls in Parliament to have this shown in every school in the country, right? That this is a seminal work around which policy should be made, right? It's opened people's eyes up to this new horror of online radicalization. Like, what is the extent of that? And I mean, is that all real, or is that just fluff? You know, will young boys and girls be having to watch this in their PSHE lessons, 5 years from now?
I wouldn't be surprised, because the likes of Lottie Moore and the Family Education Trust have done some extensive research last year into toxic masculinity classes in schools, and they find that the overwhelming number of schools in Britain have introduced kids to phrases like toxic masculinity, and have shown them diagrams including the sort of pyramid of misogyny that starts off at the bottom with traditional gender roles, protector and provider, and ends at the top in rape and domestic abuse, as if there's some kind of ineluctable relation between the two.
It's kind of like what we saw with the sort of Sarah Everard case, where that young lady was murdered by a crazy police officer.
Yeah, Wayne Couzens, who's
exactly.
a known predator within the police.
Yeah, and then suddenly you had people in Parliament talking about how bullying in schools, and young boys bullying people in schools, would lead to psychotic rape and murder.
Yes, as if somehow a notorious sex criminal and flasher is emblematic of the general opinions that men have of women in this country, which I find reprehensible, and
that there's a conveyor belt from one to the other.
Yeah, exactly, as if there's a sort of deterministic trend between wanting to look after your wife and children and then going out and abducting, raping and murdering random women. And the reason I think this is the sort of direction of travel for education and the government at large is because last year, as I reported on for Courage Media, the former government anti-extremism advisor Dame Sarah Khan teamed up with Home Office funded communist activist group Hope Not Hate to produce a report about the trends of violent extremism in the country, and it focused myopically on conspiracy theories, the far right, and manosphere misogyny. And she advised that new government departments be made in the Cabinet Office and the Department for Education to surveil people like Andrew Tate, named specifically, and to create the kinds of toxic masculinity, anti-manosphere lessons using the PSHE, sex and relationships education lessons, which the Conservatives in their era made mandatory in, I think it was 2020, and to educate young boys into opposing misogyny as they define it. Now, the two problems I have with this: first of all, I won't take lectures from this government on lessening misogyny when they are en masse importing men from cultures which put the burden on women to dress so they would say modestly, but let's say repress them in head-to-toe burqas and niqabs, to constrain the violent sexual appetites of men in those countries. Like, if you're going to import misogyny, don't give me lessons on misogyny. And the second thing I would say as well is one of the scenes which has been made into a meme online from the show has been a female teacher sitting down and subjecting Jamie to a kind of struggle session. And it's meant to be cathartic in this. This has generated all the sort of Newsnight responses of why don't men cry more? And let's go talk to Caitlin Moran, demented feminist who hasn't held a healthy relationship together, about what's good for men. But in this scene, this teacher slowly, with a stone face, breaks down Jamie's defences until he is reduced to tears. And my former colleague, Carl Benjamin, actually had a very good take on this, which is, although this is a very extreme example of it, this is the worst kind of approach to boys and men who might be trending in the direction of Tate, because all you're doing is you're presenting them with an ambassador of all they think is toxic and powerful about femininity. 75% of teachers and school staff are women. Again, I've got those in my family. Many of them do a good job, but it does mean there's an absence of male role models, particularly for those young boys, as I've already said, almost half of in the country, who don't have a father figure at home. And so if they are day in, day out in a school environment where they are told to sit still, shut up, pay attention to things that they're not interested in, they can't work out the differences from other boys in the playground with physical violence, aggression or competition because they're told it's toxically masculine, and then when they act out, they are told to sit down and work through their feelings in a verbal way until they're reduced to tears, it doesn't suit their intuitions. It's just going to frustrate them further. It's going to make it like they're not being listened to, and actually push them more towards the exact kind of extremism that these classes purport to be so worried about and want to eradicate. So it's counterintuitive, and I don't think the government has a good plan nor credibility on this issue.
Right, so we have this debate about positive male role models, and it seems that all the media class can sort of conjure up sort of celebrities, male celebrities crying. And you mentioned, and I think the Rakib Ehsan Spiked article, which you mentioned just now, did bring up this question of lone parent households, the figures relating to fatherlessness in the country. And it seems remiss of our political class not to mention this when we're talking about boys needing sort of stable homes and good examples, which they would find, not sort of scouring the internet for strong men who have lots of girlfriends and, get up to sort of fairly attractive, seemingly attractive hijinks.
Well, not just attractive.
Because Andrew Tate is the bogeyman everyone is referring to.
Yeah,
right?
and he is gross. I mean, I would like to state that for the record. I've often called him a pimp turned imam. I don't think he's a credible voice on what is and isn't masculine.
And he's being investigated for all sorts of sexual offences, human trafficking.
Yes.
At the moment.
Yeah, and whether or not those are credible, it's not the best role model in the world to have that hanging over your head at all. Let's put it that way. I think there are probably other people that young boys could look up to that don't have those kind of charges hanging about them. But point being, as you've alluded to, in lieu of Andrew Tate, what role models are they providing? And they're not. Instead, they're either putting up these blubbering, socially incontinent messes, which I think it was Christina Hoff Sommers once said, the education system is presenting to convince boys that they're somehow defective girls, and they've just got to be more feminine in order to rid themselves of their toxic masculinity, kind of ablute themselves of the sin. And also, they're not encouraging the kind of family cohesiveness that is a bulwark against boys acting out in this way. In fact, in this series that's being promoted, they're presenting it as an insufficient way of stopping it, because any boy at any time could be ideologically captured by Andrew Tate and go and stab a bunch of girls. And I will say the reason for this, and it's going to be uncomfortable to say, is because stating that a heterosexual married couple is the best thing, at least the ideal thing for a child to be raised in, indicts the project of absolute freedom without consequences that both the socialists and the liberals have embarked on since the Enlightenment. Because if they turn around and say, well, we're going to try and encourage stable two-parent families, then it's going to turn around and say, you're being homophobic because you're opposed to two mums raising a boy through surrogacy, or you're keeping women in abusive relationships because here are these marginal cases where no-fault divorce have kept a few women in abusive relationships, and obviously that's tragic, whereas the overwhelming number of divorces, which spiked after the passage of no-fault divorce in America and the recent passage in the UK, are for reasons to do with the parents' emotional compatibility or their lifestyle, and the needs of the children are always subordinated. Katie Faust is very good on this. If you try to push policies that actually prevent this kind of stuff, of boys becoming violent, acting out, joining gangs looking for father figures in lieu of having a dad in the home, you indict that project of unalloyed adult freedom. This is the stuff that Miriam Cates has been talking about, for example. Miriam Cates has been saying about the need for a ban on smartphones for under 16s because of the likes of boys being exposed to pornography between ages 8 and 11, and now the overwhelming number of sexual assault cases in this country are actually child on child, with pornography being cited in over 50% of the cases. But now the smartphone ban has been seized upon after the production of Adolescence, with Guardian journalists writing, well, we finally need to pay attention to this. We didn't care when it was TikToks indoctrinating young girls into transgenderism and sterilizing them, but we now care when young boys are watching Andrew Tate clips. So again, they don't want to deal with these problems because, one, it indicts their ideological project, and two, they're only adopting previous solutions which have been provided by people that actually did care, now that it's politically convenient for them, and they have the boogeyman of Andrew Tate to blame.
But what degree do you think that this is sort of reducing certain social problems to health and safetyism, couching everything in terms of sort of like online harms, to which the state then has to step in to manage social relations, to fill in, step in to the role of the father figure. You mentioned sort of unadulterated freedom on the one side, but you also have this sort of statist approach to managing social relations, which this seems to come down to as well.
I think it's a bit chicken and egg. So there is a degree of using adolescents to manufacture consent for expanding state power and enacting censorship laws that they always wanted to do anyway. We've seen this with other forms of media. Peter Hitchens in Abolition of Britain documented how Tony Blair had mentioned Deirdre from Coronation Street's false incarceration in the 90s in conjunction with like policing crime and courts reform. Then we had in 2022 a Coronation Street storyline about a young autistic boy called Max being groomed by the far right, and also a mention of grooming gangs, but the grooming gangs were run by a white property developer and a white policeman as well. Absolutely no mention of the predominantly Pakistani Muslim perpetrators at the time, kind of brushing it all under the rug and increasing the scaremongering about the far right lurking around every corner. We had last year an ITV drama called Breathless to do with the COVID pandemic that depicted the NHS as racist because it was marginalising the concerns of foreign doctors who were raising the alarm about this the entire time, pinning it all on the government for not locking down faster, further, earlier. There was also Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which then kicked into gear the Post Office inquiry. And of course, those postmasters are underserved, but the fact that it took a TV drama to instigate that shows that we're basically governed by Netflix.
Well, this is interesting, right? I mean, so the Post Office inquiry, that was kicked off on the basis of no real new information. And it seems that for our sort of, boomer political class, the only way in which something is real and can be dealt with is if it exists in the sort of pop cultural media sphere. And until it's filtered through that, it doesn't exist. We have the data.
Yeah. A friend of mine once said, for boomers, the TV is a primary sense organ. And I think that all of this is proving it true. So there is an extent to which this is, propaganda to justify what the state wants to do anyway. But also I think it's a clean-up effort because, as we've already stated, the predominant fans of Andrew Tate are young, first and second, even third generation immigrant children, mainly from black or Muslim households. And what's happened as a result of increasing ethnic diversity and demographic fracturing is that by proxy, culture has fractured too. We see this with increasing levels of Islamic radicalism as documented by the Henry Jackson Society in their polling last year, which found that views like 52% of Muslims wanting depictions of the Prophet Muhammad outlawed, or about 75% thinking that Hamas did nothing wrong on October 7th, is mainly concentrated among university-educated, second-generation British-born Muslim males, 18 to 30. And so what we're seeing is a censorship of the internet, a suppression of the public square, in order to manage the organic cultural fracturing and the deleterious social and criminal consequences of the immigration policy that is still being continued by the government that's trying to clean up their own mess. So there's a little bit of, we're trying to engineer more powers that we already agree with, and a little bit of, oh hell, we've now got this unexpected problem that our ideology doesn't allow us to admit to, let's clean it up quickly in the only way we know how, which is totalitarianism.
Okay, and then I think finally on this topic, there's the interesting question about why we are spending so much time focusing on young boys. There's tremendous amounts of data showing that young girls have increasingly become radicalised, particularly to the very, very, very far left in a lot of Western European countries. Young men still seem to vote roughly in line with the average of the population. And I have a graph here from Germany, which we can put up on the screen. Women have deviated, young girls under 30 have deviated very, very far to the left. There doesn't seem to be any conversation about radicalization in that area.
So I think, if I'm correct, it was about 25-point swing from the population average towards Die Linke, the Communist Party, in Germany among young women. And it was only a 4-point swing towards the AfD from young men. The only country that isn't really seeing this level of polarization as projected was actually America, where young men and young women actually swung towards Trump, at least young white women, young black women, particularly young college-educated white women as well, aren't big fans of Trump, but still, in aggregate, it's healthier there. I think the reason we're not seeing it is because women are now the foot soldiers of the regime. They're a regime client group. The reason that, as well, a young white boy was depicted here with no sympathy for his plight, despite the fact that young white boys are the worst performing in education and employment now. The gender pay gap, as it was previously touted, even though it was basically a myth because it didn't account for hours worked, seniority of position, etc. But the gender pay gap, insofar as it exists, has inverted for young men and women. Young women are now far out earning young men, and this is a problem because lots of young women, of course, want a young man who is earning well in order to get married to him, and so this is actually cutting off women's dating options at the knees, which is tragedy for both sexes. Young men are outnumbered at university. They are underperforming in terms of school readiness and grades at GCSE and A-level compared to young women. But there's no sympathy shown towards them because they're opposing identity groups in this sort of oppressor-oppressed framework are the regime's client groups. And so the young black and other minority ethnic boys who favour Andrew Tate, who are more likely to commit violent crime per capita, who have broken homes, well, we can't criticise them or the lifestyle choices of their parents because they're an oppressed minority. So we can't actually acknowledge the problem. We can't criticise young women because their left-wing politics are derivative of their pursuit of unalloyed freedom, which is the provision of equal material goods, the provision of abortion on demand, the war against biology that is transgenderism. We can't criticise any of that because imposing any criticisms on those ideas are a form of oppression, and again, young women are furthering the regime's revolution. So the only acceptable group to criticise is young white boys, even if this fictional example doesn't really jibe with reality.
Right. Okay. Well, that sort of sums up that adolescence topic. Moving on to these signal messages, which were leaked by The Atlantic by Jeff Goldberg in a piece he wrote on the 24th of March. A bit of context for the situation. On the 15th of March, the US began bombing Houthi rebels who have, in the Yemen, who have been causing chaos, causing havoc on global supply chains, especially, coming through the Suez Canal. Michael Waltz added Jeffrey to a signal group titled Houthi PC, I think Principals Committee Small Group, which contained various national security officials, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, for example. In that chat, they were discussing the potential attacks or the sort of the future attack on these Houthi rebels and the bombing campaign which was about to take place. It has raised some serious questions about how sensible the sort of US administration, the government of the day, how sensible they are. Well, I guess, how much care they have for national security and whether they've really put President Trump in a compromising position. Just some details from that chat, which I think are interesting, and then we'll talk about that security question. You have J.D. Vance saying, I think we're making a mistake. 3% of US trade runs through the Suez, 40% of European trade does. There's a real risk that the public doesn't understand why it's necessary. The strongest reason to do it is to send a message. You have Pete Hegseth saying, he doesn't want America to look indecisive, so they should do things on their own term. And he sees the objective as restoring freedom of navigation, which is a core national interest, and reestablishing deterrence, which Biden created. J.D. Vance says, I hate bailing out Europe again. And Hegseth agrees, saying, European freeloading is pathetic, but he thinks one of his colleagues is correct, and only the US can really get the international order out of this mess. Before we talk about some of those sentiments expressed in those messages, let's talk about the potential political ramifications. It seems like a massive cybersecurity breach. Should they have been going out on Signal, these messages? Should there be a group chat on Signal talking about serious foreign policy?
As far as I know, Signal is pretty well encrypted, and the main faux pas that has not been resolved is why Michael Waltz added the Atlantic editor in the first place. Now, some people have suggested it's a 5D chess move to get the Signal, if you pardon the pun, out to Europe, that the Trump administration's foreign policy agenda is to get Europe to remilitarize, gain a degree of independence, start contributing more positively to NATO and paying its fair share, as Trump once said. We all remember that infamous photo of Angela Merkel scolding him and Shinzo Abe as he sat there just not having it. It's an absolute delight.
But do you think that's likely? Given that J.D. Vance has been incredibly blunt in every single speech he's made and every single interaction, especially after sort of seeing Zelensky being hectored in the Oval Office. The message is out, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was necessary if it was 5D chess. So I'm just putting the theory out there to possibly dispel it. I would like to know actually why he was added, and it's also important to note that there have been Senate testimonies ongoing with National Security Director Tulsi Gabbard and John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director, and they confirmed that there was nothing confidential in these chats. That they did ask, Ratcliffe did, that one CIA operative's name, even though he's not operating undercover, is not named because he's not a sort of publicly appointed official. And so the Atlantic complied with that bit, but because it wasn't confidential, they then just published the rest of it, which difficult situation. I am interested in why Goldberg felt the need to publish all of this. I think it's because The Atlantic is an openly anti-Trump outlet, and I think it took a sizable donation from the Zuckerberg Foundation back when Zuckerberg was still backing Biden to cover COVID in an unfavorable light against the administration. So I think there is a motive to depict this chat as a breach of national security. I don't think legally it will meet the threshold.
But to be fair to Goldberg, he didn't sort of compromise national security. He didn't release the chat before the bombing campaign went ahead.
No.
So the whole story is, why are their government officials using? And Signal has been a platform which has, the Pentagon has said previously, it has been hacked by Russia at various times. There was some question about whether Steve Witkoff, special envoy, was literally messaging while he was in Russia. But that's disputed, so I'm not sure, if any new information has come out on that just yet. And then in terms of there being nothing of sort of national security interest, it was information about an active operation.
Well, it wasn't confidential. It's not that it wasn't national security interest. The only reason I'm saying that it's unlikely to meet the legal threshold is because you would need intent to leak, and Hegseth discussing these plans, because lots of them came from him. It's not likely that he knew Goldberg was added. He didn't add Goldberg. In fact, they're actually discussing whether or not he'd had a few beers at the time and let a bit loose. So it's unlikely that he can be prosecuted for the intent to leak. But also, if they've declared that it's not classified, then you can't be prosecuted for leaking classified information. It's just backfired in that by saying that, now everything's been published. And so you're getting this bitter spat as to whether or not J.D. Vance holds Europe in contempt, which has been the outgoing message that the likes of Keir Starmer and the BBC have ran with. And the reason they're doing that is, I think they're making either a disingenuous attempt for post-nationalist EU politicians to play patriot at a time where their popularity is sinking and try to look defiant against Trump's polarizing position on Russia and Ukraine, to say we will have unmitigated support for Ukraine. By the way, we're not really raising our defense spending that much. By the way, we can't really do anything about America say so, but we can at least beat our chest and look like we're valiantly defying the Donald. Or I think they're misunderstanding what Vance and Hegseth are doing. And Vance, as he said, has been very blunt in recent months about, at the Munich Security Conference, at recent speeches, about Europe's need to rearm itself, but also Europe's need to stop censoring its own populations and to combat what he calls the enemy within as a product of mass migration, which I think is namely Islamic terrorism. As he joked about at NatCon right before he was appointed VP, he had said that the UK will be the first country to become a nuclear-armed Islamic state. By the way, Pakistan exists, so he jumped the gun on that one. But anyway, I think this is all emblematic of Vance and Hegseth's opinion that Europe need to invest more in military rearmament because relying on America as protectorate states has allowed their welfare states to grow as a kind of in-kind contribution for not spending on defense, which has then acted as a net draw for mass, unproductive, tax-dependent migration, which is not culturally compatible. And I do know for a fact that it is the agenda of the American State Department to see that kind of mass migration in Europe as a human rights violation. So they are reorienting their policy around that, and they are reorienting their policy around making it so that European leaders have to pay attention to their populations who have time and time again in many elections rejected this level of mass immigration, which is a net cost, which increases crime, which changes culture, and have been treated to increasing levels of it anyway, in spite of their best wishes. So I think what this shows is that actually, both publicly and privately, the administration is remarkably consistent on thinking that Europe needs to foot the bill for its own defence and that needs to stop censoring and punishing its own populations with immigration.
But it does seem that the resentment is very much there, actually, from these messages. And for the piece I wrote in Courage a couple of weeks ago about why J.D. Vance is right and Europe should pay for its own defence, and then also outlining why, if your imperial overlord gives you the opportunity to sort of rearm and reindustrialize off the back of that, you should, bloody well take it. But I also outline some of the history of essentially sort of the global American empire and what might be construed as US imperialism in Europe and across the world. And so the US, if it does decide that it wants to sort of retreat from some of its overseas commitments, it does have to be careful how it does that while also maintaining its integrity, good alliances. Withdrawing overnight would be a disaster for Europe because we would lose a lot of the security guarantees that we have and we've become soft as a result of. And so, the US probably has to be careful to manage the withdrawal in a productive way. And I think it is sort of worth pointing out that the reason, this is a global supply channel which Europe struggles to defend is because in 1956, at the point of the Suez Crisis, America literally undermined British and French interests in Egypt, control of the Suez, to be based off a committed ideology of decolonialism and the primacy of America in governing the sort of international maritime order.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Suez, actually, because do you know... So there's a good book called Lords of the Desert which documents this, and it's over Middle Eastern foreign policy, particularly around 1945 and afterwards. I don't know if many people know this, but in exchange for forfeiting the troops stationed in the British Mandate over Palestine and later around Suez, America gave Britain more money as part of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding loans after the Second World War, in order to set up the NHS. Mm-hmm. So the kind of modern foundation myth for multiculturalism, which is still the leading justification for unalloyed mass migration in this day and age, was instigated by the global American empire surpassing in a Thucydides trap the British Empire in that region. And now Vance is saying, well, why is it in our interest anyway? Now,
so the calculation is, exactly that. We will, Pax Americana will pick up the mantle of Pax Britannica and we'll run with it. We'll give you money to expand your welfare enterprise domestically, and then obviously you have, however many years down the line, a US administration who says, actually, this is crazy. And a lot of Europeans who broadly agree with them, including myself, and I think including you. So it really is a question about how you manage the relationship between yourself and your client states to keep it a productive one going forwards.
Yeah.
And I think that is where, tone does matter, your rhetoric does matter, and J.D. Vance is an incredibly intelligent man. I just think he should be careful with how he manages that realignment of relationship.
I think the tone he's taking is fine, but I actually disagree with his stance on the bombing. And I think Hegseth and the Trump administration are right here. And let's put this in the context of why the Houthi rebels are actually bombing the shipping lane in the first place. It's because the Biden administration loosened up funds as part of the Iran deal after Trump froze them, after the Obama administration and Biden began it, sending pallets of cash to Iran in exchange for them not building a nuke. And then lo and behold, the major terror subsidizing state in the world decides, hey, we've got a slush fund here for this stuff. We won't spend it on that. So that frees up more funds for terrorism. And then they go and fund things like October the 7th and all of the terror groups in Lebanon and the like. And so they funded the Houthi rebels in order to bomb American ships that were going through the Suez Canal. And so it's actually the fault of the Americans that this has happened in the first place. And so I think it's in America's long-term strategic interest to do this, because at the same time, Trump is reigniting the Abraham Accords. And I think the purpose of the Abraham Accords isn't just to get it so that Israel isn't surrounded by enemies on all sides, but it's to create a lasting peacekeeping force that is located within the region. Because if you can get the Emiratis, if you can get the Saudis, and if you can get the Israelis, maybe even the Egyptians and the Jordanians on the same side, it means not only do we have a sustainable way to manage the Palestinians in Palestine, but you can also keep Iran in check, you can ice them out of the economy there, and you have the Suez shipping lane freed up for both the EU and America without needing to station constant American troops there. So if clearing the Houthi rebels out as the Abraham Accords are being ratified is the price you have to pay. I think it's a worthwhile price. And then America can go around, snapping up Canada and Greenland and ensuring that the Atlantic trading routes are all tickety-boo for them as they go along.
Well, I mean, that is exactly what Hegseth sort of said in that chat. That was exactly the sort of reason that he gave, the messaging that you could give out to the public, which I guess J.D. Vance conceded on and was convinced by. Okay, so now back to the UK. The spring statement by Chancellor Rachel Reeves has just been put out. I'm going to read a summary of some of the budget, and then I guess we'll discuss some of the sort of interesting points. So firstly, welfare cuts. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, said Labour's party of work. She proposed cutting the number of people qualified for personal independence payments, PIP, saying that people are wasting their potential, they're wasting their futures, they're wasting their lives, being dependent on the government, to save the UK about 4.8 billion by 2029. The OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they've halved their growth forecasts for this year, but they've increased them for the following few years, which we might be sceptical about. We can discuss. No tax increases. Seems like a good thing. Well, no tax increases, as stated by Rachel Reeves, but promising to use cutting-edge technology to clamp down on tax avoidance, to make a further 1 billion. In terms of spending, defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP, funded by international aid cuts, which again seems good and aligned with the sort of general mood of the country. Scrapping NHS England, which I was happy to see, to give more money back to patients. NHS England obviously being this quango full of people employed to do who knows what, with lots of replicated sort of responsibilities. Civil service cuts of 15%. Civil service costs being cut by 15%. I don't know how that will be achieved.
Very skeptical
to save 2.2 billion. If it's just sort of firing half the civil service, maybe you could be on board with that, but I don't think that's what they're proposed to do. And then various other promises to increase the efficiency of state provisions and public services using technology. And then lastly, is quite interesting, on planning. The OBR said that the government planning reforms will permanently increase GDP by 0.4% by 2030, and house building will reach a 40-year high, hitting 305,000 homes a year by the end of the forecast period. So that's 1.3 million homes in the UK over the next 5 years. I think Labour promised 1.5 million homes being built, but 1.3 million homes is quite close to that. Do any of those raise concerns for you?
All of them. So we might have to go through some of these line by line. You might have to remind me. Okay. So first of all, if they're pledging to cut £5 million...
Welfare cuts. Well, we can start with welfare cuts.
Yes.
Good?
It would be
Bad.
good. It would be good. However, not drastic enough.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, this was mainly instigated because Max Tempers, again on X, probably the most powerful Twitter account in the UK at this point, caused a firestorm about mobility vehicles being, let's say, dubiously claimed by people that have new ADHD diagnoses ever since the pandemic and are now getting brand new BMWs. And so there are quite a few people that are doing that. So they're clamping down on things like that.
Is it something like 20% of people, or, of new cars being bought based off this mobility scheme? Or is that how many people are claiming benefits broadly in the country?
No. So I don't know about the percentage of cars, but it's 25% of all people of working age, that's 18 to 64, are claiming disability benefits.
Right.
So a quarter of the working age population. I think it's 1 in 8 young people are not in education, employment, or training, so they're NEETs.
So this is a case where Fraser Nelson's concerns on an issue may actually be right on point.
It would be right on point if he wasn't also in favour of importing millions of foreign nationals every year, insisting they're as British as you and me. 95% of visas every year are given to non-net taxpayers. So, unfortunately, he's very concerned about the sort of sewage that's coming out the pipe, but doesn't want to turn the tap off. Mm-hmm. So that's an issue. Also, the 5 billion in cuts is nullified by, I think, an 18 billion in unexpected borrowing, additional to what was forecast. So this sort of black hole, this fictional 22 billion pound black hole, is very much one of Labour's own making. Also, spending is rising to 1.3 trillion. So keeps going up. Debt to GDP has fallen just below parity of 100%. It's about 98.8%. But then remember from the autumn statement, which has been the entire cause for growth projections to halve in less than 6 months from 2 to 1%. Rachel Reeves says that we're only growing GDP because Labour's mentality is if the public sector spends more, that's more economic activity, therefore more GDP. So GDP per capita has stagnated, if not fallen, since the 2008 financial crash. But by spending 2% on government departments increased every single year, GDP is going up.
And this is the treasury brain problem, right? This is the problem of our sort of political class. How do you fudge the GDP figures?
Yes.
When really the metric that is most affect people's lives is, how much money they have in their pocket, GDP per capita, and how GDP is divvied up among the population.
And this GDP
and funnily
figure
enough, that actually goes down when you add a lot more people into the population.
Yeah, and that GDP figure is actually going to be the reason why they're not going to be able to do the civil service cuts. Now, bear in mind, we, per capita, have a larger civil service than communist China. And that has gone up only under the Conservatives and has now ballooned increasingly under Labour. There's lots of Labour ministers who have said they believe the public sector is more productive than the private sector, so they'll face internal resistance from their own party, but they'll also face internal resistance from the civil service for two reasons. First of all, any attempt to interfere with the civil service is impossible because of the Tony Blair Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which puts the Civil Service Code into law, which means that the civil service are a neutral body, which means that any interference in the civil service, its structure, its personnel, its appointments by an elected minister is politicising the civil service, so they're basically unsackable, no matter what they do. This is why the likes of Sue Gray had to have a very long holiday in the Bahamas and then get appointed to the Lords in order to be gotten rid of as Keir Starmer's chief of staff. And the other thing is that civil service members get a year's severance pay. So any cuts to the civil service don't show up in the annual budget. And all of these growth projections are done yearly. So if you decide to say, well, I'm going to cut this government department, not only do you face resistance from the civil service in terms of civil service code, but the OBR will say, well, there's no point because it's not going to factor into our short-term growth projections, so find the cut somewhere else, which is why they can only go for pensions or things like the winter fuel allowance or something like foreign aid. Now, foreign aid usually requires an act of parliament to do it. With a parliamentary majority, they can. But the foreign aid cuts are actually very deceptive as well because the major line item of foreign aid is illegal migration. It was £14.4 billion in 2023. So the majority of our foreign aid is spent internally on illegal migrants in Britain. Under Yvette Cooper's plan...
And that's housing them in various hotels.
Legal aid fees, everything. Under Yvette Cooper's plan, that's being moved to the welfare budget, which one, means they don't have to publish the figures, but two, as Conservative MP Nick Timothy has costed, according to Cooper's own statements, is going to increase the bill to £32.7 billion every year. So it's going to keep going up. And it's going to go up even more because we're now getting record numbers of them crossing over, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the idea that this money is going from the foreign aid budget, which we're wasting overseas on these nations that hate us, and is going to go into the defence budget, arming us against those nations anyway, it's for the birds, and it's falling afoul of Sir Neil Ferguson's law, which says that any great power that spends more on servicing its debt than on its foreign aid budget, on its defence budget, rather, is no longer going to be a great power. Do you know how much we're spending on servicing our debt every year?
Go on.
£100 billion, dwarfing our defence budget. The welfare budget is also major factors higher under the Conservative and Labour governments than our defence budget. So none of these things spell fiscal responsibility, sustainability, or a government that's interested in fixing those things. The final thing I'll say as well about the cutting of NHS England, fine, I'm all for cutting unnecessary bureaucratic bloat and waste. But the NHS, as I've written about for Courage Media, is about to embark on an almost £11 million multi-year clinical trial into puberty blockers after Health Secretary Wes Streeting just claimed credit for banning them. And this means that hundreds more children are going to be subjected to medical experimentation, despite us and the Tavistock Clinic themselves knowing as early as 2014 that these puberty blockers are given out on the false premise that you can change sex, that they cause brittle bones, they cause infertility, they cause cancer, they cause atrophied brain development. So what quite this £11 million is being spent on, other than to medically experiment on more confused children, is beyond me. And you could save £11 million and do the right thing tomorrow by cancelling it, but instead they just want to trim around the edges and cut people from non-frontline roles in NHS England and then claim credit for reducing the civil service.
Right, so you're either fiddling at the margins or this is a masterclass in sort of just fudging, cooking the books, basically.
Yep.
I guess also just on the final point on planning, and house building. We're currently running a deficit of 4.9 million homes, and that's increasing. Building 1.3 million homes is not going to cut it. And at the rate of migration that we currently have, those 1.3 million homes are going to people essentially from overseas.
70% of new homes are going to go to new migrants. And that is under the OBR's projections, where the OBR's annual migration projections have been wrong by a factor of 3 or 4 thanks to the Boris wave. And despite Keir Starmer saying that this was a one-nation experiment in open borders, global Britain, he then decided to don the lab coat and continue it because levels of migration have been consistent under the Labour government. Now, they could end this tomorrow, as Sam Bidwell has written eloquently about before, with a stroke of the Whitehall pen and not passing primary legislation by suspending indefinite leave to remain, as Kimmy Badenoch has advised. She's advised it a little less stringently than Bidwell has, but nonetheless, Yvette Cooper could spare us all the £234 billion bill of these unproductive migrants staying here after 5 years forever and going on welfare, by just changing the time span at which you can claim indefinite leave to remain. They're refusing to do that. So they're presenting these like fiscal, demographic and cultural time bombs to the electorate and then just going, well, you know, we've got the scissors and it's hovering over the cord, but we'd rather not snip it for reasons. As far as tax rises as well, and I will point this out, they said we're not raising taxes on working people. Now, they've reneged on their promise not to raise council tax because that's going to go up and that's going to hit homeowners as well. So if you actually wanted to buy one of those brand new homes, good luck affording it. They are raising energy bills because Mad Ed Miliband, is under his new Quango GB Energy spending, as we've just announced, another 200 million on solar panels for hospitals and schools. And they've also just voted against banning the import of solar panels from the Xinjiang region using slave labor because China produces 80% of global solar panels and Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps produce 40% of the materials that go into said solar panels. And they've gone, well, you know, we're kind of comfortable with human rights abuses so long as we can impose high energy renewables costs on our population. Britain already has the highest level of energy costs in the developed world. So all of those things are going to hit working people. But also what's going to hit working people is unemployment. The OBR thinks that unemployment is going to go up because of this stuff. It's notable that the CIPD are forecasting job losses as well, and business confidence is at an all-time low. And thanks to the £25 billion rise in employer-side national insurance, which is basically the extra tax that you pay on income to subsidise the NHS and pensions, this is going to make employing people on PAYE, so full-time salaries, prohibitively expensive. So either redundancy is going to be made or new hires are not going to be made and businesses are going to cut costs, meaning that the growth is going to shrink in the long term. And what's even worse is that Labour have an employment rights bill coming up. They're saying it protects workers' rights. Well, it only has protections for workers' rights insofar as you can get work. And the OBR think that this is going to be pretty catastrophic, as they put in their briefings. But they couldn't cost how catastrophic it is because strategically, Labour only presented them with the outline of the Workers' Rights Bill on the day of the budget, so they couldn't factor it in. So even if the OBR's modelling is right, and it's very questionable, I mean, look at what they did to Liz Truss, frankly, leaking the briefings, getting it wrong, undercounting tax receipts by, I think, 30 billion when it was much better than they thought it was going to be around the time of the mini-budget. The OBR can't provide us with the numbers as to how bad Labour's regulation for growth is going to be on businesses because Labour have decided to omit said numbers at the exact time that it would have been reported and made it look even worse for Rachel from accounts. So the entire thing is just a complete shambles.
Soup. This dovetails nicely, we just touched on it, on those Home Office asylum contracts. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what the situation is there.
Yes, so we are now spending 5.5 million a day, and that's at the low end of the estimate, on hotel fees for illegal migrants. Now, we have had 6,100 at time of recording cross the English Channel, break into Britain via small boat since January. This has been now a 30,300 total since Labour came to power last July. That's a 40% increase on the year prior. So it's something about Keir Starmer that seems magnetic to these people smuggling gangs he promised he would smash and hasn't done a single one. Also, they keep saying that deportations are up. This isn't true. Voluntary returns are up to nations like Brazil and Western Europe, which means that we are paying people to go home with a few £1,000 stipend when a Ryanair flight is 15 quid. So actually, Labour are not getting a handle on illegal immigration. It's getting much worse. And so now, what a new Quango that Rachel Reeves has set up has promised. This is the Treasury Department's Office for Value for Money. paradoxically named because it's another government quango taking taxpayers' money to sit around looking at spreadsheets all day. They have said that of these 1.5 million new homes promised, the target being very unlikely for building to ever be met, that a certain section of these will be portioned off as dispersed accommodation for asylum seekers, illegal migrants. And the justification for this is that it costs £145 a day to house an illegal migrant in a hotel. Again, the budget previously $14.4 billion for 2023, looking to be $32.7 billion for 2025. Instead, it's £45 a night £14 a night to host them in dispersed private accommodation. Under the Conservative government, they were walking around and procuring private rental properties for this purpose. This is during said housing crisis. So the government is using your taxpayer money to buy up homes that you are trying to save to afford, to put up illegal migrants at your expense. It's an entirely perverted scheme.
Huge upward pressure on property prices as a result.
Quite. And at the same time, of these 1.5 million homes being built, a certain section of them going to illegal migrants as part of what Angela Rayner once called Operation Scatter to, quote, equitably disperse illegal immigrants around every borough in the country. OBR project at least 1.5 million migrants will be let in order to build those homes in the first place. We have former Chancellor Lord Philip Hammond going on Times Radio and Sky News yesterday saying that a degree of managed migration, which is a former Labour Home Secretary Barbara Roach's phrase, is necessary in order for this house building to go ahead, and that Labour need to expend political capital in convincing the public that this is necessary, even though migration is the least popular position for all parties in the country. So, pretty astounding stuff that, as we said about Treasury orthodoxy, despite this massive bill coming in from the Boris wave, immigration is still seen as a net good, either through necessary skills, which never seem to be filled, or because just increasing raw GDP is the priority, and you only do that by increasing the population, never increasing productivity or never increasing GDP per capita. So, essentially, if you're a law-abiding British taxpayer, you're getting the shortest, bluntest possible end of every stick.
Yeah, I guess so. The problem with sort of the Treasury approach to all of these things is the ledger just isn't big enough, right? You have the Treasury, working out the sort of doing a cost-benefit analysis in certain discrete areas, and the numbers just do not match up across each of those areas. Hence why you have to bring people in to build and then actually not factor in how much they will be drawing from the state in terms of, essential services, schooling, NHS fees.
Or just needing somewhere to live like every human being does.
Exactly. So that's pretty damning, I suppose. And then lastly, and I think we'll just touch on it really quickly because we can speak about it at more length later on, next week, for example. Islamophobia. This Islamophobia bill. What can you tell me about the government's proposals in this area?
So this is actually connected to the prior topic because as the IMF projected in October, there will be an increased number of anti-immigration protests going forward, and this presents a particular fiscal barrier to economies because they, again, believe immigration is a net good. And it connects to the first topic because cultural fracturing is likely to increase this stuff. And so in order to manage the mess that they have created, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, Angela Rayner, has decided to convene an Islamophobia blasphemy board, which I've written about for Courage before.
Emphasis on the plural there, communities.
Yes. Yeah. Communities which exclude the settled white British population of the country.
But also just this idea that there can be no community,
Yes. There is no we, there is no our.
No, everyone's in their siloed places.
Though interesting that this Islamophobia definition, which previously was written by the Muslim Council of Britain in conjunction with Health Secretary Wes Streeting and Hope Not Hate, which said that Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism that targets Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It's about as robust as the what is a woman definition that was kicking about a few years ago. It's interesting that has now been thrown out in favour of a new definition because one of the equalities advisors to the government said that actually violates the Equalities Act. So they're still pressing for a definition of Islamophobia, but one that doesn't violate their own laws that they want to keep in place. And so there's now the new law that targets sort of perceptions of Muslimness that's led by Dominic Grieve, who is a former anti-Brexit Tory MP and Attorney General who violated the Whitehall ban on engaging with the Muslim Council of Britain after one of its deputy leaders signed the Istanbul Declaration, which was perceived as a mandate to fire on British naval vessels that were in Palestinian waters. Grieve violated that by going to an awards dinner in 2011 while working under the Cameron government. He is now heading this up. He wrote the foreword to that former Islamophobia report. And this definition will include Islamophobia towards Buddhists, Sikhs, and Hindus in case they are perceived as being Muslims. So what it actually is, it's a law that targets white Britons on the grounds that they're less likely to be mistaken for a Muslim, Christians and Jews, because of their religious garb and beliefs, they're less likely to share commonalities with the Muslim population. So this is yet another example of a two-tier justice system.
But it is also essentially a thought crime.
Yeah.
It's all intentions-based.
Yes, exactly. And the most insidious part of this, as Toby Young has mentioned before, is it probably won't require primary legislation. Instead, much like this new sentencing council guidance that punishes straight white men and gives them more stringent sentences because they don't get a pre-sentencing report that might lighten their sentence because they're members of marginalised communities, this will probably just be passed through with policing and judicial guidance. So it won't even be fought in Parliament. This will just be another quango of demented activists like Qari Asim, who's a Leeds imam but also a trustee of Hope Not Hate, that's passing this law to benefit aggrieved community interest groups at the behest of the law-abiding, settled, non-troublemaking population. And this is yet another totalitarian overreach to manage the so-called benefits of diversity.
And this comes down to sort of the previous discussions which we've had about this massive democratic deficit which is operating in this country, which needs to be sorted out and is completely insidious. I think we've sort of covered all of those topics quite briefly today, and it's been quite a sort of thrilling discussion. We've sort of powered through those, but it was great to have you, and that has been the weekly wrap. Thank you.